really landed on is that we don't really have a really good definition for what poetry is. If we make it wide enough to include every type of poetry, we also include every other type of writing ever. If we narrow it down just a bit, we run the risk of leaving out specific genres of poetry that are still quite valid as within the genre. So we decided we can't really put our finger on it other than that it really has to do with emotion as a whole. It really is about emotion. That's what's at its core. It's about connecting, as all writing is. And I'm going to point to it up here even though you can't see it. You know that since I'm at the front of the classroom, the 6 traits are up there. And that's really what we focus on in any type of writing. Ideas and content, organization, voice, word choice, sentence fluency, conventions. Now they're a little bit different in poetry, but we'll explore that in the next couple of days. I don't need to talk about that now. But really, the reason I'm mentioning it at all is because it is about being able to connect with your reader. See, poetry, a lot of people like to say, oh, well, you don't have to get it, that's fine. I'm not writing it for you, I'm writing it for me. Well, careful with that. Because yes, you are writing it for you. All writing is for you. I mean, you're writing it with an audience in mind, but it's something that you have on your heart to share. And so you never want to alienate your audience. One of the beautiful things about poetry that we've all discovered as we've read it or as we've listened to it, because you've noticed that the works that I've been bringing to you are music. They're songs from actually a lot of different eras. But I brought to you 4 specific songs. And the reason I did that was because you're used to listening to the radio and listening to songs for meaning, just like you're used to watching TV and movies for meaning. You're just, for whatever reason, scared when you see words on a page. You say, no, I'm not going to get it, I can't. You already know. The music is reflective of the emotion that we're talking about, this connection to the audience that we're talking about. And all of the hooks are catchy and this and that, but really they just reflect the words that are on the page. When you memorize some music, when you memorize a song on the radio, you're like, oh, I really like that song, I'm going to memorize it. What are you trying to memorize? The words. It's good enough for some people to just listen to some certain songs and be like, yeah, that's kind of catchy, yeah, that's kind of fun. But when something really moves you, it's usually the words. So how do poets do that? That's kind of what we've been exploring with these 4 examples, with Sound of Silence, and Just the Way You Are, and Vanilla Twilight, and My Oh My. We've explored really a wide variety of emotions. When we looked at, and you can go back to Friday's post to get the video for Sound of Silence, but when we looked at Sound of Silence, you didn't need me to tell you it was about the Kennedy assassination to feel empty and cold and isolated. The words did that. Now you happened to know the backstory to why Paul Simon wrote it. And we had a nice long discussion about how when worlds change, people really focus differently than they did in the past, and they think differently, and that can really do some upheaval, some emotional upheaval within us. We did Just the Way You Are. You didn't need to know that it was about his falling in love. You kind of could get that emotion from the words. There's no story contained in either one of those poems except for the poet. The poet was releasing the emotions. But each of those seemed to explore the same emotion. What we got into today with Vanilla Twilight was different shifts in emotion. Because when we started talking, we were looking at what a poet does, because that's really what we have to focus on in this unit, is what a poet does. What poetry is doesn't really work. It's too broad. So we're going to look at the tools that poets use to make these connections. Well, as you were looking at the organizer that you have in the middle of your... I'm going to go as close as I can. Hopefully it's focusing, and hopefully it'll focus back on me when I come back. But in your packet, you have poetic devices. And when we were searching for what's at the core of these poetic devices, and the whole list is in there, and you can download the packet from Friday's post at the bottom of it if you need to. But when we were looking at it, we saw, yeah, stanza, verse, rhythm, rhyme, repetition, imagery, consonants, accent, all those things. But really what was at the core was mood. Because we were talking, and emotion is what the audience connects to and what the author is trying to create for the person. So mood logically is the heart of poetry. Just like conflict is at the heart of prose, of literature, because without a conflict, you'd never be able to resolve it, which means you'd never be able to learn something, and that's something that we learn is the main idea that we walk away with that changes us. Well, in poetry, mood, you don't really have much of a poem if mood isn't channeled in some way, shape, or form, whether it's directly by the author or as it's felt by the reader themselves. So we landed on that as really where we should start looking. And so in today's exploration of those two final poems, and yes, they both turned out to be songs that you were, at least a lot of you were familiar with the artists, if not the songs themselves. What we found is that poetry doesn't just have to be about one emotion and layering that same emotion up with metaphors and images. It can be about shifting moods and tones and all of those things, and the devices that authors use, that poets use, in order to make that happen. I'm going to go back. I'm not going to read the whole poems because you've got them in your packet, and I don't want to beat a dead horse. But we thought about, at the beginning of Vanilla Twilight, where he's talking about the stars leaning down to kiss you, I lie awake and I miss you, and I wish you were here, and all of these. I watch the night turn light blue, but it's not the same without you. It takes two to whisper quietly. He's talking about the silence. He's talking about missing her. And there's really is this sense of loneliness that creeps into the first bunch of stanzas in this. And then we get this convention of repetition, this notion of repeating. I don't feel so alone, I don't feel so alone, I'll think of you tonight, I'll think of you tonight. And all of a sudden, through that convention, as the poet, he was able to allow us to glimpse his shift in mood, something that is glimpsed in the music video itself when Shaq does this. And you'll see, the videos are posted down below this one. But the tone changes completely. The mood changes, that poetic device we're talking about. When violet eyes get brighter and heavy wings grow lighter. And it's all about moving on and remembering her fondly, this love that he lost, and yet moving forward and not being so cold anymore in his own memories, but using those memories to move forward. Poetic devices, enabling us to feel emotion and move forward. My Oh My by Ben Haggerty, which of course you all know by now, is Macklemore. This notion that I had you put aside was not only can moods change, and not only can poetry be specifically about creating images that will evoke mood, but they can also tell a story, because a lot of people don't realize that, I think, when they think, oh, I'm not good at poetry, oh, I hate poetry, I don't like poetry. Well, you're so good at writing stories and telling stories, why wouldn't you be good at poetry? Because it's not the same thing. Well, not necessarily, but, and again, I won't read the whole thing to you, but when we had that discussion about Dave Niehaus, the Seattle Mariners play-by-play guy, it conjured up memories of Rick Jeanneret and the Sabres play-by-play guy, and memories of all of the wonderful things that happened to these teams that you grew up rooting for happened through this voice. And so all of your childhood memories kind of can get channeled through this voice. And that's what Ben Haggerty Macklemore did in this. He kind of explored his own relationship with his father, his progression through life, and honored the death of Dave Niehaus through a story that showed how relationships have changed for him, and shows that, you know, the city itself of Seattle, where he's from, and the memories that he has of this one thing that he and his father really connected about, baseball, were really partially also Dave Niehaus and the announcer and what he did to bring him and his father closer together. And so it becomes this beautiful story of walking him through a moment from his childhood where the Mariners won the division series on a walk-off hit by, who was it? Edgar's up to bat, so it must have been Edgar Renteria, I'm guessing. And Joey Cora rounds third, and here comes Griffey. And this is even like taking me back a little bit because it was 1995, but listen to this. We'd huddle around the radio, twist the broken knob, 7:10 a.m., no KJR, Dave Niehause's voice would echo throughout the yard. Couldn't have been older than 10, but to me and my friends, the voice on the other end might as well have been God's. 1995, the division series, Edgar's up to bat, bottom of the 11th inning, got the whole town listening, swung on and belted. The words that started, Joey Cora rounds third, here comes Griffey, and it goes on, and it tells this story. And then it moves him through when he becomes mature, and he starts talking about his dad and this mitt that he's looking at, and these old baseball cards, all this stuff that he's put away, and it's just stuff now. Memories embedded in dust, but life's what you make of it. He said, this is what you make of it. Yeah, we play to win, living like we're under the lights of the stadium, fight until the day God decides to wave us in, right? Until he waves us in. Now he's talking about death, and we move through this progression, and we get all these different emotions that come through. And our exploration of poetry as a unit will be, how do they do this? How do these poets get you to feel these things? Because even when I was just reading them, before you guys knew they were songs, you were captivated. And it's the words. It's the words. Again, I keep going back to it. You know how to listen to music. Think of poetry as music. Analyze those words. See what they do. And you're going to come up with some really good stuff. So that was our big, long discussion today, was about mood and about where we go from there. But I also want to take one time and touch really quickly on something that we covered in a couple classes today. We're going to cover in more depth tomorrow. But I know you guys think I'm a loser and I'm a dork and all this stuff, but this idea of connection has been around for so long. And Macklemore even talks about it in that video, and I encourage you to watch that video to the end. Don't just watch to the end of My Oh My. What he says about connection and the oral tradition is really true. And that led me into this discussion about stanza and verse. See, verse is what we used to call poetry in general. And now it's kind of evolved into something because it's become a particular type of stanza in the music that we do, that Macklemore talks about, part of this oral tradition. But it's really rooted in a whole bunch of old fat dead white guys who, these Greek philosophers who lived thousands and thousands of years ago, who really started off the structure of our modern music with their Greek theater. And I'll explain to you what I mean. So, Greek theater was set up much like any theater is set up today. You'd have a playing area, you'd have a big space for people to sit, and they would watch this happen. And it would be part of a festival, and it would be part of an offering to the gods. And so in this playing area, there would be an altar, and there would be a stage. Well, these were set up in a 5-act structure. And the actors would come up, and they'd tell the story on the stage, okay? And they'd say it all in verse, which is rhythmic and rhyming speaking, and they'd do that to tell the story. So you'd have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 acts, and they'd all be in verse to tell the story with the few actors. But something very interesting happened in between these acts that were being spoken in verse. A whole bunch of dudes, like 50 dudes usually, about 50, would come in from over this way, and they'd stand up front, and they'd have an agreed upon script and dialogue that they would do with one another, and they'd be mimicking what they thought the audience should be getting out of the production. Main idea? Ring a bell? Okay? So what they would do is they'd come out and they'd be like, hey, did you see that action? Yeah, didn't it make you think of this? Yeah, it made me think of this. And you might look at that as saying, well, that's kind of cheap. Why are they telling them the main idea? Well, because we want to get that main idea across. We want to make sure we're connecting with our audience so that they can take something away from it, they can learn. Well, these guys were called the chorus, the Greek chorus. And they would come out and talk about the main idea, and they would come out in between these verses. You get the chorus, the chorus, the chorus, the chorus. Hey, does that look familiar? Verse, chorus, verse, chorus, verse, chorus. That's how your songs that you listen to on the radio are set up. And in the verses you get the stories, but the real main idea that the artist wants you to go away with is the stuff that's repeated the most, repetition, in the choruses. The main idea is locked up in the choruses just like it was all those years ago. We're going to talk about that more tomorrow. But I don't want you to think that I'm just this guy who only likes this stuff because I'm nerdy. No, it's part of your everyday life. This is communicating. This is connecting. And the more you know about the history of it, the better off you'll be. I'll see you tomorrow. Have a wonderful day.